problem was that I did not spend quality time with my sons, and I was very selfish, all wrapped up in the things I wanted. And looking back brings me so much pain. I only wish I can go back and do it all over again. But in life, there are no do overs. One of the most horrible things I ever did occurred one night after me and my wife Linda came home from a club, something we would do every weekend for years, and we were both pretty drunk. On this particular night, my mom was babysitting for us, and we were taking her home when me and Linda continued our fight, which started on the way home from the club. She was in the back seat just going off on me, and I began to smack her while I was driving right in front of my mother. The reason why this was so horrible was that my mom thought that at least one of her sons had turned out to be halfway decent. I mean, I had a family, I owned my own home, and that night she probably had flashbacks to when my father used to beat her and figured I was just like him. From that night, she totally went downhill and ended up overdosing on pills. The ambulance took her to the hospital but could not save her. And on May 31st of 1993, my mother passed away. I knew this was all my fault. I never let on, but the guilt weighed very heavy on me. And for 2 years, I would visit her grave with fresh flowers every week. So many of us take flowers to grave sites after someone we love passes away. If only I had the wisdom to have done this while she was alive. Less than a month later, on June 29th, 1993, my best friend, Benjamin Venti, died in a helicopter crash on the runway of the El Monte Airport. Benji, as everybody knew him, was a very decent guy. He was my foster brother for the short time I lived with the Ventis. He would take me out on his helicopter to go eat or just cruise over LA. He even used his helicopter to help me look for my dog when he got lost. Benji was what I called a babe to evil. He never had experienced the harsh realities of this world. His parents and rich lifestyle kept him hedged in. He never did drugs and was very honest. The world can only be worse off when it loses someone like Benji. My son Gabriel began running away from home, and somehow social services found out that I was using the belt to discipline him. Then came to our home and warned me not to do it again. I was very strong-minded and told the woman I would do it again if I had to. Well, I did it again, and my mother-in-law notified Children's Services. The social worker, accompanied by police, went to the Hillside Baptist Academy and pulled both of my sons out of school and put them in foster care. This really shook everything up. My wife, who until that point agreed with corporal punishment as a form of discipline, now suddenly turned on me, saying it was all my fault. We had to go to court and were ordered to take parenting classes, or we would not get our kids back. Me and Linda attended classes, and about after 6 months or so, they returned home. The whole thing turned out to be a small blessing. While my sons were in the foster home, they had to live with, according to them, terrible food and cockroaches, and returning back to our beautiful home with a large swimming pool and excellent food, they realized what they had taken for granted. Many did not have, and they were thankful. We seemed very happy to be back together again, and I believe we all had a new appreciation for the value of family. As soon as my son Gabriel turned 18, he moved out and in with his grandmother. He pretty much did not want to live by any rules, especially mine. Gabriel bought himself a motorcycle and started becoming a stunt rider. Sometimes we would ride to church together, and he would show me some of the stunts he was learning. I believe one of his motives was to prove that he could be better than me. I have to admit that he was a better stunt rider than me. His stunts on the freeway would terrify me, and I would just race ahead of him because I just could not bear the possibility of watching my own son crash at such high speeds. Though I was known for my street racing, we would run a quarter mile for cash, and then though I did not win them all, I won most of them with large crowds watching. It was pretty exciting. Canyon racing, in which I would literally risk my life to keep from losing, was also pretty exciting. In fact, twice I had to be flown by helicopter from the mountains, Angeles Crest Highway, to the nearest hospital. These were just 2 of 17 motorcycle accidents, which ironically happens to be the exact same amount of motorcycles I have owned. I have always been obsessed with motorcycles. 3 times I have been arrested for evading arrest, but this was before running from the police became a felony. Let me say, that was an adrenaline rush. I would just never stop from being pulled over by the police. Sometimes I would invite my biker buddies over. We would party, shoot some pool, and I think my son Gabriel thought I was pretty cool. But my lifestyle, which seemed okay at the time, would end up being something I would really regret. I really did not want to have my sons be like me. I had everything I ever wanted as a boy. The family, a pretty wife, the home, plenty of money, and even many pleasures. But one thing I could never really obtain was real peace and happiness, because no matter what I accomplished, I was still just a punk from East L.A. I never really dealt with all the childhood issues, the insecurities, the rejections, fear of abandonment. I could never really believe that my wife would really love me, and I always thought it was just a matter of time before she too would leave me. I could never really trust her and thought, given the chance, she would cheat on me. Looking back, I cannot believe the kind of person I was and how very difficult it had to have been for her. In 2002, my father passed away from cirrhosis of the liver, alcoholism. Some years before his death, I would try to reach out to him, asking him to have lunch, but he would always have an excuse as to why he could not make it. Most of the time, he would not even come to the phone. He would have his wife tell me he could not talk right now. So when his wife, Mary, called me and asked me to go see him in the hospital and that he was just about to die, I said to her, "I am sorry, Mary, but he is just going to have to die without me," and explained to her how he never wanted to see me anyways, and expressed my anger. Mary called me right back, knowing that I went to a Christian church. A few years before, I had invited them, and she said, "Doesn't the Bible say to honor your father?" I could not answer her back, for that commandment has no conditions. All I could say is, what hospital is he at? This turned out to be one of the greatest blessings of my life. Me and my wife Linda went to the hospital and went up to the room where he was, and it all just seemed to be a divine plan of God. Mary immediately told Linda, "Let's leave them alone." Now my father was really bad off. He could not talk, but he looked at me right in the eyes and could only nod yes or no. Now I knew some Bible and proceeded to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with him the best way I knew how. I remember sharing John chapter 3, verse 3, where Jesus says, "Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." And I asked him to close his eyes and pray with me inside his heart and mind, asking Jesus to come into his heart, forgive him for his sins, and be his Savior. And after we prayed, my father just looked at me with this wonderful smile I will never forget. And one small bonus to this whole thing was that when I began to share with my father, my phone rang in my pocket, and I quickly pushed a button to silence it. And it actually answered it. And it was my son, Abram, who heard the whole thing. And I hoped he was proud of me. And at least this once, I could truly be a good example. At my father's funeral, I went up to speak, and before the whole church of Roman Catholics, I was able to share very important Bible truths without preaching to them. I indirectly shared with these folks by just reciting what I told my father in the hospital right before he died. The most important one being that unless we are born again, we will never make it into heaven. Then I turned around and pointed to my father's corpse, which was laying in an open casket right behind me, and said, "This is not my father. This is just his body, a shell. He is in heaven with God." I was the only one to speak that day, and after the service, my older brother Chewy and one of my cousins came up to me and told me they had planned to speak but changed their minds after they had heard me speak. Not only that, but the priest came to the pew I was seated in and asked me to pray for him. This really touched my heart because of his humility, and I will never forget him or this whole experience. I learned a great lesson from all this, that God will bless and use anyone who chooses to do the right thing. When someone tells me how terrible their father is or was, I always tell them to forgive and honor them no matter what they have done. Though I have suffered a great deal growing up without a father, it did cause me to vow to myself, well before my sons were born, I would never allow this to happen to any children of mine. On October 30th, 2003, something happened that can only be outmatched by the death of one of your own children. We got a terrible phone call. My son Gabriel had crashed his motorcycle into a pole. Me and my wife Linda rushed to the hospital. And when we arrived, the doctor told us that Gabriel might not survive the night and that his neck was broken in 3 places. The feeling that came over me was as though I was in a nightmare and very terrified and in disbelief. I would not accept losing him. This is when you realize how much you love your son and how very precious and valuable his life is. Many of the people from the church were praying for him as he struggled to fight night after night. We could just watch as he coughed up so much blood with 4 or 5 doctors all over him at the same time, trying to help keep him alive. So many bags of blood were used to replace all the blood he was losing. Me and Linda were staying the night in the waiting room, and the nurse would come in every hour or so to update us on his condition. Sometimes she would have to wake us. This was a very scary time for us. Finally, after 2 different hospitals and a few days later, the doctor told us he was going to survive, but that he would be a quadriplegic and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Gabriel would have to move back home with us after his lengthy stay at the hospital and at Rancho Los Amigos National Rehabilitation Center in Downey, California. We became his caretakers. This was no easy task. It can be very difficult and very heartbreaking. Gabriel required a lot of care, all day and even through the night. And this was very hard on Linda, for she was doing most of the work. I should have helped more. It was like we had to do everything you would do for a baby, with just a bit more. Feeding, bathing, using catheters for him to urinate, constantly rotating him to keep him from getting bed sores. Though he would still get them occasionally, then you would have to dress them and help them heal. Dealing with his bowel movements. Now we are talking a full-grown man. not being able to see an end to any of this. You just learn to accept this may be a permanent way of life. All of this gives me a deep respect for all those who are caretakers. The one good thing I remember thinking was that I was glad to have my son back home because all the problems we went through, like him rebelling and running away, and, and much of the fault had to be my own. Moving out as soon as he turned 18, spending most of his time with his biker buddies, it was like I would really never get to see or spend time with him. And now he was home 24/7. And I liked that. But coming home and finding him just weeping in his wheelchair was painful. I began to feel guilty about what happened to Gabriel. If only I was a better example. I was such a fool. Once I ran from the police with Gabriel on the back of my motorcycle. I mean, what kind of person does that? I came very close to giving up my motorcycle, but I just couldn't. My reasoning was that if he had got hurt in a car, would I then stop driving? My son Abram seemed to be doing good. Like Gabriel, we pulled him out of a private school for his senior year and allowed him to go to public school. This was something both of them wanted for their final year of high school. Abram began playing football, and we bought him a used Honda Accord. I also got him a job, though, through a friend working at a country club golf course. This was something I would come to later regret. One day, Abram did not come home, and me and Linda began to worry. Then another day would pass, and still he did not come home and could not be reached. We became very worried. Linda began calling hospitals around the area and could not find him. Finally, on the third day, she found he was at the General Hospital in East L.A., where she had called a few times, but he had not yet been identified. So she was told he was not there. We rushed over, and he looked very bad. He was still unconscious. He was in a terrible accident in which he was drunk driving. Apparently, the job I got him was a job in which the management would allow these teenagers to take beer out to the golfers in the field, therefore giving them access to alcohol. So Abram and his co-workers were drinking. This accident left Abram paralyzed. He lost the use of his right shoulder and right arm for the rest of his life. Two separate accidents, approximately 1 year apart, left us with two sons that are both paralyzed. I remember something the nurse said to us, knowing that Gabriel was there a year before. She said, "You both must be very special." This threw me for a loop. My son Gabriel was very driven, and before long, he was becoming more and more independent, making a lot of progress with the help of the folks down at Rancho Los Amigos National Rehabilitation Center. Gabriel could move his arms, but had no use of his hands. He would eventually move back with his grandmother's house. Our house was by no means a pleasant house to live in, so I can see why even Abram would move out as soon as he was 18 years old. Me and Linda fought like cats and dogs for well over 20 years, but things were really getting to a dangerous level now, as far as marriage ending. I mean, we began saying things that people should never say to each other, especially married people. One day, while we were in a very heated argument, I said something that I'm sure the devil himself put in my mouth. Linda was yelling at me, saying that she wanted to leave me. This she said many times before. And I, with what I am sure was a very mean face, looking right in her eyes, and quoted a line right out of the Rolling Stones song. "I got you under my thumb, and I got you right under my thumb, and you ain't going nowhere." And she gave me this look that I'll never forget, a look that said, "I will never love you again, and I will leave you." And at that very moment, I knew that I just might have made the biggest mistake of my life. You see, my mother was not a good mother by any means. She said and did many terrible things to me. But even at a young age, I knew that my father had put her through hell before he went to prison. My mother now, my mother now found herself with three boys, and not knowing what to do, began selling drugs herself. And with that came the lifestyle of partying, and after that all, the terrible things that happened, many of which were caused by very bad decisions that she made. It's easy for many people to stand back and judge my mother, but though my mother had a very big heart, she was not very smart. Doing drugs, selling drugs, her choice of men, trying to take care for three boys. Life was very hard on my mother, and looking back, I can't help but feel so very bad for her. When my mother needed something like furniture, refrigerator, air conditioner, or just wanted me to take her some food, she knew she could always depend on me. I always loved her very much, though I never felt that she never really cared for me. I had made a pact I had made a pact with myself when I was young that when my mom died, I would take my own life. But when her life ended, I had a family and small kids and had a different outlook on the whole matter. I say all this to say this. Linda, in her desperate attempts to hurt me or to get me to hit her so that she could have me arrested, would say awful things about my mom, like your mother was a whore, or your mother is burning in hell, doing unspeakable things in hell, or your own mother didn't want you. She would get in my face, yelling and screaming, all in which what I believe was a desperate attempt to force an end to our marriage. Our kids were gone, and she wanted to be free from me. Now there is no way I can blame her. In my desperate attempt to try to win her back, I would take her to Hawaii, Cancun, Las Vegas, or wine country, but everything I tried was in vain. Linda had already stopped loving me. The terrible thing about many relationships is that there's usually one who loves the other much more, and I was that one. This made me think of the lyrics to an old song by 38 Special. Just hold on loosely, but don't let go. If you cling too tightly, you're gonna lose control. I sure did lose control. Linda started doing whatever she wanted, going out, coming home at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, drunk and abusive. I heard a man once say that if you go up in an airplane, cut open a pillow, pour out the window all the feathers, then go back and try to collect them all, it's just as difficult to try to take back all the hurtful words that come out of our mouths. Unfortunately, I learned this to be true, and much too late. Me and Linda got together in 1980, married in 1983, just after our first son was born. And in late 2010, she left me. A few days before our marriage ended, Linda came home at about 3:30 a.m. She had been drinking, and she just went off on me. She physically attacked me, and against my better judgment, I called the police and had her arrested for the third time. Linda's mother bailed her out of jail, and her sister came over, and I heard her tell Linda not to worry, and that on Monday, they would go to the courthouse and file a restraining order and have me kicked out of the house. So I decided I would go to the courthouse on Monday with the police report in hand and file a restraining order first. Linda and her sister filed a paper in their petition that apparently made me look very bad. And Linda, looking like she just stepped out of a scene of Little House on the Prairie, no makeup, straight hair, and a dress that made her look so innocent, the judge took it, hook, line, and sinker. He said, "This marriage is definitely over," pointed his finger at me, and told me I have to get out of the house. He gave me 3 hours to get what I needed, and I was in shock. I remember walking through the hallway of the courthouse feeling numb, hoping this was all just a very bad dream. In my mind, I was positive of one thing. This was the hand of God.